What's up, everybody? Thank you all for tapping into this episode of Do Your Homework. I know it's been about a month since I put out some new stuff. This one's going to be a little bit longer. I hope you all enjoy it. We're going to continue off the first episode. If you may remember, we touched a little bit on how political associations are natural to human beings, that we are social creatures meant to live and react and interact in such a fashion. But political associations can also take on many forms of themselves, right? So, what is ideal? I like to go back to Aristotle's Politics mainly because at this time you got to understand the Greeks were creating colonies in Italy. The Greeks had colonies on Sicily. They had colonies in present day Turkey. These were places where nobody had lived before. So they just had, you would have a group of Spartan families, or you would have a group of Athenian families, or a group of families from one of the other smaller city states that would go out to these colonies and they would be essentially creating their own societies. And so this question often came up for them. And I think it's important to understand how they thought about it, because then I think we can understand a little bit more about ourselves. And I think we're going to get a lot out of this one. So, to start this, again, we're quoting straight out of the book here. Um, a lot of times, my particular interpretation is by a man by the name of Ernest Barker, and he has a lot of really good footnotes in here that come from other people who have read and translated these texts. So we're going to include a little bit of his work in here too. I think he does a really good job of putting things in the proper context because Aristotle at times can be a little bit biased and harsh. So we're going to include different kind of viewpoints. I don't want anyone to think this is completely one-sided. Uh, to start, you have to ask the question in terms of political associations. What are the things that we share in, and basically to what degree do we share in them, right? From this you can take on three things. Either one, we have nothing in common and we share nothing. Two, we have everything in common and we love having everything in common and we share everything. Or three, we share in some things and essentially not in others. Number one is obviously ridiculous, because if we share in nothing and that's the only thing we have in common, then we have no reason to work together. So there's no political association formed. Two and three are the ones we're going to talk about. Unwittingly, Aristotle really asked himself 2,300 years ago, which is better between having everything in common and having nothing in common, which is today the argument of socialist collectivism, where we share in everything, including property, or Republican capitalism, which is we share in some things, obviously, infrastructure, public marketplaces, among them, such as businesses, schools, hospitals, roads, traffic lights, police, at specific levels of governance, which we'll get into a little bit later. But we don't share in other things like property. Let's dig into the merit of each. Obviously, you guys know where I'm going with this. We're going to start with the first and quickly revisit how the state was made in the process. So, in the Politics, Aristotle is quoting from and making the argument against Plato in his work, The Republic, which him and Socrates put together. Some of these are Plato quotes and Socrates quotes. But they essentially argue that the greatest possible unity of the polis, or the state, is the supreme good. Greatest possible unity is the supreme good. And that basically the end game, when you know you will have achieved such unity, is for men to say mine and not mine at the same time in regard to the same thing. Property mostly, but taken to its logical extreme, you would include wives and children. And they actually do talk about that in the book. I'm not going to talk about it right now because obviously I don't view women as community property, but there was an argument made for it. So if you guys want me to talk about it, I will, but not now. Now, is this statement true? Is the greatest possible unity of the polis the supreme good? Well, let's first start by going back to the creation of the polis. You have individuals. Individuals pair most of the time to make families. Families then create communities. Communities then create, at this time, the polis, the city-state. Right now, obviously, these days, our polises have scaled up. Each stage achieves a higher degree of self-sufficiency than the next. So today we go from communities to cities, then we go from cities to counties, and then we go from counties to states, and then we go to states to the federal union, which we'll get into a little bit more later. Now, why do these each achieve a higher degree of self-sufficiency than the next? Well, this is a consequence of their composition being made of large and diversified populations that are mutually exchanging different services in virtue of different capacities to attain a higher and better life for each individual. Right? So let's start at the beginning. Individuals pair to create unions in marriage. Right? I'm a man. I'm attracted to women. I find a woman who's attracted to men. We are able to then have children. Boom. We are servicing each other in different capacities because we are different. And then you just scale that up. Families then create communities, right? So maybe me and some of the other men farm. Maybe a couple of the other men hunt. Maybe some of the women garden with the older kids. Maybe some of the women stay home with the younger kids. Maybe somebody's making clothes for everyone, right? At this time, this is, especially at Aristotle's time, if you have a colony, this is essentially how it works, right? So you're able to observe these things. You're not able to observe these things anymore, but to a higher degree, it's the same in your community. If all of the women are nurses, for example, there's nobody in your community who has a stay-at-home daycare who can watch the kids. It's just not possible. You're all at work. So you need a large and diversified population to be able to serve these different capacities. It's the same thing now that we have road networks and we have electricians and we have plumbers. We have larger and more diversified populations. And that is how we create the state. Therefore, by nature, a state is some form of aggregation of different types of units. You cannot skip any steps in the formation or maintenance of the state. Okay? It needs to be formed one way and it needs to be maintained as such. And we'll get into that again a little bit later. Therefore, Aristotle argues that should it become more of a unit, as Plato suggests, it will first become a community, then a family, then an individual, as each stage down is more of a unit than the next. Right? Thus, the state will cease to exist. And surely, what is best for something is that which preserves its being. You cannot lose your being. I can't tell you those berries are poisonous, but they're good for you. No, they'll kill you. They'll get you very, very sick at the least. Right? So it has to preserve your being to be good for you. So becoming more of a unit is not good for it. He further argues that there is a state short of this at which the polis remains, but, quote, will nonetheless come near to losing its essence and will thus be a worse polis. In that, quote, it is as if you were to turn harmony into mere unison or to reduce theme to a single beat. There is harmony in the diversification of skills and basically, skills and services and what you can provide to the state, right? And you have to have these things in order to have a state. Otherwise, you just have small communities of people who are just getting by, right? But you can achieve higher forms of things. Aristotle's able to sit around and write all day because there's a large and diversified economic spectrum. Or basically, it's a marketplace. To put it simply, everything is a marketplace at the end of the day. Here's the kicker. This is obviously crazy, but there's another way for it to actually be done, really to be enforced upon people. Aristotle argues that the scheme could possibly work if it were practiced by the governed class and not the governing guardians. So in Plato's scheme, basically there's a class of people that communally own and farm the land. And then there is a class of guardians that governs and protects it, and they're allowed to own arms, and the other people are not. We're going to get into why that's completely ridiculous here in a second, but we'll just keep going for right now. He goes on to say the spirit of fraternity is likely to exist to a less degree where things are common. In this particular quote, he says wives and children, but if you're sharing wives and children, you're sharing everything, okay? So, where everything is common, and the governed class ought to have little of that spirit, it is to obey and not attempt revolution. This is why I really wanted to talk about this week. For those of you who are paying attention, you know where I'm going with this. As we see it happening right now in the global organizations, the WEF, the UN, the WHO, and their sympathizers and supporters in our own government and across the world. They want people at the lower levels of society to think, act, and live a certain way, while the lives of whoever their buddy, select, elite class have zero hindrances. They want you to stop eating meat while they eat steak and lobster at COP28 or whatever the fuck it was. They want you to stop driving your cars. They want you to stop using your gas stoves. They want you to stop using your combustion engines to farm food products. They want you to stop taking commercial flights. They want you to stop using access to cheap energy to heat your homes, all in service of the greater good, whatever the fuck that is, in this case, global warming, while they take private jets around the globe to complain about the same and eat steak and lobster while they do it. It's bullshit. You know it, I know it. You know, and they go on to say just as much. They talk about you will own nothing and be happy. You will own nothing and be happy. Not me, not I, not us. You, not we, not everyone. You will own nothing and be happy. They have absolutely no intention of following through with any of this. None. They're not going to eat synthetic beef. Bill Gates is not doing that. He'll tell you to do it because he thinks he can, but he has no intention of doing that. None whatsoever. That's why I don't get why people fall for this. It's completely ridiculous. Now, I could hammer home on this longer, and I'd like to, but again, we pulled from this book because I think Aristotle does a tremendous job leveling it on his own. And this, again, I want to remind you, this is 2,300 years ago. 2,300 years ago when this man wrote this. Okay. He writes, legislation such as Plato proposes, which is the socialist collectivism that we've talked about, may appear to wear an attractive face and argue benevolence. The hearer receives it gladly, thinking that everybody will feel towards everybody else some marvelous sense of fraternity. All the more as the evils existing under ordinary forms of government, lawsuits about contracts, convictions of perjury, excess luxuries of the rich, all those sorts of evil things that occur in society, right? Everybody's going to be taken care of, are denounced as due to the absence of a system of community property or access to such. None of these evils, however, is due to the absence of communism. They all arrive from the wickedness of human nature. And in fact, they actually feed into the wickedness of human nature. There's nothing more wicked than sitting here telling me I need to feed my kids fake beef while you eat real beef, knowing that this fake beef ain't shit. How is that not the lowest of evil? That's not the greatest of evil or the lowest of dirt. Like, come on now. That's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. Trying to reduce tax breaks for farmers and think, like, what are you trying to do? Like, run up the price of food? Why would you do that? Oh, because we can afford it, and they can, and they're going to have to eat this synthetic fake shit that we make in some bullshit factory. I mean, it's the most evil thing you could possibly think of. It feeds the system, okay? And as does this idea of getting rid of the Second Amendment, which essentially creates a class of governing guardians and sheep, which even Aristotle says makes the people who have no weapons slaves to the ones that do. He even argues that. I'm not going to pull a direct quote out. You guys can look it up, but he even says it here in this book. If one class of people has arms and one doesn't, in this case, the governing body has arms and the governed body does not, the governed body are slaves to the governing body. That's how that works, right? That's why we have a constitutional republic that says shall not be infringed. This is not a democracy. You can't vote that out, okay? That's why I hate when people try to say that we have a democracy instead of a constitutional republic. No, we have a constitutional republic. Okay? And even Thomas Jefferson himself says, I prefer dangerous freedom to peaceful slavery. And that's exactly what Plato and social collectivism argues for. They argue for your peaceful slavery. No, freedom sucks, guys. Okay? And that we've already segued into the second part, which is why the United States Constitution has been successful. To be intellectually honest, we'd have to compare different constitutions, but we've already pretty much leveled the other side, and so we're just going to talk about our side for a second. Here in the United States, we have to answer the question, because we still have that third question: what are the things we share and what are the things we don't? Okay, here in the United States of America, we share in specific things: infrastructure, obviously. We share in, which includes schools, hospitals, roads, dams, bridges, the like. We share in education because of the schools and everything. But we also share in the Constitution, the ideals and the principles of the Constitution. That is what makes America, America. Right? The Second Amendment, which we talked about, the First Amendment, which protects my right to sit here and talk about it, and the freedom of religion, and the freedom of the press, and the freedom of assembly. The Third Amendment, which doesn't allow troops to sit in they can't just send the United States Army to your house and say, hey, kick you out and make them live there. There's no quartering troops. The Fourth Amendment protects property. The Fifth Amendment allows you not to incriminate yourself. The Sixth Amendment, Seventh, so on and so forth. Each of them protecting the right of the individual so that they can be active in their community, right? And prior to the 16th Amendment, which shouldn't be there, which gives the federal government the right to tax any income, basically as they see fit, in perpetuity, which is bogus. Before that, we still had railroads because we shared in a public marketplace. We shared in business amenities. You and I can all shop at the same stores. There aren't stores that are open to you that are not open to me. There used to be like that way, but they're not that way anymore. We can all agree to that. And even when they were like that, we still had schools. We still had railroads. We still had the latest in every technology readily available. We still had more businesses. We still led the world in GDP, even when all that stuff was the case. So we can really take off now once we get rid of the shackles of the regulatory government that's not meant to be there at all. Don't know why they're there. They should not exist. But I think it's mainly because the states have been derelict in their duty in the 10th Amendment, and they have let the Washington, D.C. train get out of control. That is personally why I signed up to be with the Convention of States. Because I do believe that it is a cause that is very much worthy of bringing up. DC's not going to check itself, right? But the way it's meant to work is to protect those individual rights and the rights of the states, the individual states, because the states created the union, not the other way around. Okay? So we share in the Constitution. We share in the fact that we have a republican form of governance. That means we are built on the rule of law. You cannot democratically vote to take away people's guns. You cannot democratically vote to take away people's houses. You cannot democratically vote to take away to censor certain speech that you don't like. You can't do that. We have a republican rule of law. You can elect representatives to go represent you in a government that is bound by this rule of law, but you can't. And we share in that as well. We share in our participation of government and our right to self-govern. These are all the things that we share in. But as far as property and opportunity and all these other things, those are things that you have to earn through the free marketplace, which is something we're going to get into in the next episode. But in a democracy, the majority rules, and that's it. In a constitutional republic, you have certain laws, okay? And the laws are the laws. Now, why is this important? Okay, the law requires, as Aristotle says, the passage of time to become a habit, to become something that must be adhered to, right? So the rule of law as a constant provides a stability that the swaying mood of masses does not. To give you an example, there's been no political party, there's been no political party, Democrat or Republican, to win 3 straight elections. That's 12 years. It's not a long time. Not a long time at all. 12 years ago, I was 16. 12 years. No one political party has won 3 straight elections since 88. Since 1988. And before that, it wasn't one person won 4 in FDR. And I don't think it's been done before that. I'd have to go back and look. Possibly in the 20s, because they got tired of the progressive BS, which I don't blame them, because they just started amending the Constitution on a whim with the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendments. And the 18th got overturned by the 20th. Right? So the question is this: do states lose or gain by changing traditional laws when some other or better law is available? At the end of the day, the answer is yes and no. Okay, Aristotle writes, indeed, the relics of ancient customs which are still in existence here and there are utterly absurd. It would therefore be an absurdity to remain constant to their notion. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, what we fought the Civil War over, okay, obviously those had to be changed. Right? But when you get into changing laws and getting men accustomed to changing laws, then you effectively break that habit of obeying the rule of law, and then you just start changing things on a whim, right? This is why our tax code is 70,000 pages, because you just change and change, and it doesn't mean anything anymore. And then you see this with the progressive movement, and like I said, the early 20th century, when they just added 4 amendments, and they ended up needing a 5th to overturn the third one. You know, and it's ridiculous. And they've amended the Constitution more since they passed the 13th, since they abolished slavery than they did before then. It's crazy. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I'll tell you right now, the progressive ones, other than the 19th, have all been a catastrophe. And really, they're all accompanied the feminist movement, because the feminist movement was really the driving force. The feminists were really the driving force behind the OGs, were the original ones behind Prohibition in the first place. It's a bunch of housewives. And if you don't believe me, you can go look up the Ken Burns documentary on it. So there's a whole documentary on it. And look, these women had good reasons. Their husbands were coming home drunk as a skunk. There were no laws for marital rape. There were no laws for marital abuse in the same way that there are now. So they had a legitimate gripe. A gripe that no longer exists. They had a legitimate gripe, and the answer to the problem that they came up with was very short-sighted and did not work. That's what happens when you get people just amending the Constitution on a whim. Even our founding fathers knew better than to do that. If you go back and read the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson writes as much, that men need to reflect deeply and not take the task of parting from one form of governance and going to another lightly. That's in the Declaration. We understood what we were doing. It was a monumental task to just change laws. Sometimes it's necessary. And in the case of overturning laws that are necessary, we need to do that and go back to the original customs. The 17th Amendment, the states need representation in Congress. That's how it's meant to work. That's why it's a republic, because the states are represented at the federal government. The people are represented in government through the House of Representatives. That's how it works. Now, we'll get into more of this on Monday, because I can go on forever. But I will leave you with this for right now. This is, again, from The Politics, Aristotle. Quote, we must not ignore the teaching of actual experience. We are bound to pay some regard to the long past and passage of the years, in which these collectivist ideas would not have gone unnoticed if they had been really good. It would shed a great deal of light on the value of these ideas if we would watch the actual construction of such a constitution. I would say, Aristotle, we actually have the data now, and we know that you are right, and we appreciate your work. Till next time, guys, thank you for tapping in. This week's episode was a little bit longer than most, but I hope you guys enjoy it. Please leave any comments, feedback, subscribe by all means, like. Let me know what I can do to enhance the experience for you guys. Like I said, this content's for you, and I look forward to the next one.